Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Tom Bennett moved to the suburbs seeking peace, but an unexpected discovery shattered his tranquil retreat. Soaring electricity bills led him to uncover a secret. His property was funding the local HOA's streetlights and park. What began as an anomaly turned into a battle for justice against corruption and deceit. Tom Bennett had always valued his independence. After years of living in the bustling city of Atlanta, he longed for peace and quiet. That longing led him to a charming suburban home on the outskirts of the city, a modest property surrounded by lush greenery and positioned at the edge of a sprawling residential community governed by a homeowners association, HOA. Tom had been deliberate in his choice. Not only was his house a retreat from the noise of city life, but it was also outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. For Tom, this meant freedom from rules about mailbox colors or lawn heights, and he relished the autonomy his property promised. For the first couple of years, his life in the new home was idyllic. He spent his days working remotely and evenings on his back porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the treetops. The neighborhood was friendly but distant, exactly how Tom preferred it. The nearby HOA community bustled with activity, but its boundaries were clear, and he assumed his life would remain separate from theirs. Little did he know, his new home would soon become the focal point of a complex and unsettling battle. Tom first noticed something unusual about a year and a half into his residency. His monthly electricity bills began to creep upward, seemingly without reason. At first, he chalked it up to rising energy costs, or perhaps an aging HVAC system. But as the seasons changed, the bills continued to climb. Even during the mild winter months when he barely used the heating, the charges remained inexplicably high. Puzzled, Tom made small adjustments to his habits, unplugging unused appliances, upgrading to energy-efficient bulbs. But the bills remained stubbornly inflated. What tipped him off was a pattern. He traveled frequently for work, leaving the house unoccupied for weeks at a time. Yet, during those stretches, his electricity usage barely decreased. Something was wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Tom contacted his local utility company to request an inspection. When the technician arrived a few days later, he conducted a thorough check of the property, starting with the meter and moving systematically through the wiring. The technician's discovery left Tom stunned. Buried beneath the ground, an unauthorized cable extended from Tom's property to a network of streetlights and public park facilities, both belonging to the HOA. Someone had professionally tapped into his electricity supply, and the setup wasn't recent. Judging by the wear on the wires, it had been there for years, likely before Tom had even purchased the house. This wasn't done by amateurs, the technician explained, shaking his head. It's a clean job. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Tom's peaceful retreat now felt tainted. His trust was shattered, and a new sense of urgency gripped him. If someone had gone to such lengths to exploit his property, what else were they capable of? He realized he couldn't ignore this intrusion. His journey to uncover the truth and seek justice was about to begin. The discovery of the unauthorized connection weighed heavily on Tom Bennett's mind. What had initially been a mystery about inflated electric bills now revealed itself as a deliberate scheme orchestrated by someone within the HOA. Frustration gave way to anger. This wasn't a minor oversight or a simple misunderstanding. This was theft, pure and simple. And if someone was bold enough to siphon his electricity to power the streetlights and park facilities, what else were they willing to do? Tom knew he couldn't let it slide. It was time to confront the issue head-on. The first step was documentation. Tom took detailed photos of the illegal connection, with the technician providing additional technical explanations and diagrams. He also requested a full written report from the utility company, which confirmed the unauthorized tap was supplying power exclusively to HOA-owned structures. Armed with this evidence, Tom contacted the local police department to file a formal report of theft. The officer who arrived to take his statement seemed surprised by the level of sophistication involved in the scheme, but assured Tom that the matter would be investigated. Still, Tom had his doubts. He realized that if he wanted accountability, he'd need to push the issue himself. Next, he decided to approach the HOA directly. Tom gathered his evidence and headed to the association's office, a small, nondescript building near the neighborhood's Central Park. Inside, he was greeted by an administrator whose forced cheerfulness faltered as soon as he mentioned the unauthorized connection. After a tense exchange, she ushered him into a conference room where he finally met Robert Sloan, the HOA president. Sloan was a tall man in his 60s, with a carefully groomed appearance and the polished demeanor of someone accustomed to exerting authority. He listened with feigned concern as Tom laid out the situation, presenting his evidence and demanding an explanation. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Bennett," Sloan began, his tone overly diplomatic. "If there's been a mistake, we'll look into it. But let's not jump to conclusions. These kinds of issues can be complicated." Tom wasn't buying it. "Complicated? My property has been paying for your streetlights and park facilities. That's not complicated, it's theft. I expect a resolution, and I expect it fast." Sloane's polite mask slipped for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "I assure you we'll investigate this internally, but these things take time. Let's keep things amicable while we sort this out, shall we?" Tom left the meeting feeling stonewalled. Sloane's reluctance to take responsibility only fueled his suspicions. Over the next week, Tom began noticing subtle but unsettling changes. Anonymous flyers appeared in the neighborhood, accusing an unnamed homeowner of disrupting community harmony and jeopardizing public safety. Neighbors who once waved as they passed now seemed colder, offering only stiff nods or avoiding eye contact altogether. Tom suspected the HOA was behind the smear campaign, attempting to turn public sentiment against him. Then came the anonymous letters. Stuffed in his mailbox, they contained thinly veiled threats, warnings about legal battles, escalating costs, and even suggestions that his reputation in the community could suffer if he pursued the matter further. It was clear the HOA wanted him to drop the issue, but Tom refused to be intimidated. Instead, he doubled down, hiring a property rights attorney to explore his options. His attorney, Rachel Carter, was sharp and relentless. After reviewing the evidence, she confirmed that Tom had a strong case for both civil and criminal complaints. "They're banking on you backing down," Rachel explained, "but they've overplayed their hand. With this kind of evidence, we can hit them hard." Tom's determination deepened as Rachel guided him through the next steps. Together, they sent a formal letter to the HOA, outlining the theft and demanding immediate compensation for the stolen electricity, damages for the stress caused, and a guarantee that the connection would be removed at the HOA's expense. The letter also warned that failure to comply would result in legal action. The HOA's response came quickly, but it wasn't what Tom hoped for. They offered to reimburse his electricity costs, but dismissed the demand for damages and refused to admit wrongdoing. In their letter, they downplayed the issue as a misunderstanding and insisted they had acted in good faith. Infuriated by their dismissiveness, Tom knew the battle was far from over. He started to dig deeper, searching for more evidence to strengthen his case. That's when he stumbled upon a potential gold mine, a former HOA contractor willing to talk. The man, a retired electrician named Steve Harris, revealed that he had been hired by the HOA years earlier to install the underground cable. They knew exactly what they were doing, Harris said, his voice tinged with regret. They didn't want to pay for a proper connection, so they found a cheaper way, at someone else's expense. With Harris's testimony, Tom's case grew stronger, but the more he uncovered, the more resistance he faced. HOA board members began avoiding him altogether, and Sloan stopped responding to emails and calls. The tension in the neighborhood escalated as whispers and speculation spread. Tom, however, refused to be silenced. What had started as a simple dispute over electricity had now become a full-blown conflict, and he was ready to see it through to the end. Tom Bennett stood at the crossroads of frustration and resolve. Armed with damning evidence, a determined attorney, and the testimony of a former contractor, he was ready to confront the HOA head-on. The stolen electricity was no longer just a personal violation. It was a glaring example of institutional abuse that demanded accountability. Tom's patience had worn thin, and now it was time to escalate the fight to the public eye and the courtroom. The first major clash came at a hastily called HOA meeting, ostensibly to address community concerns. Tom attended, despite knowing the board's intentions were far from conciliatory. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had been swayed by the HOA's smear campaign. At the head of the room sat Robert Sloan, flanked by other board members who looked equally smug and uncomfortable. Tom could feel the weight of their collective disdain, but he refused to be intimidated. As the meeting began, Sloan stood to address the crowd. His tone was patronizing as he spoke of maintaining harmony and avoiding unnecessary legal disputes. Without naming Tom directly, he implied that his actions were disruptive and selfish. When Sloan opened the floor for questions, Tom stood, holding a thick folder of evidence. "I'd like to set the record straight," Tom began, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't about harmony, it's about theft. The HOA has been stealing electricity from my property to power public facilities for years, and I have the evidence to prove it." The room fell silent. Sloan attempted to interject, but Tom raised his voice slightly, silencing him. He began laying out the facts. The utility company's report, photographs of the unauthorized connection, and the contractor's testimony. Murmurs spread through the crowd as residents began to question the board's narrative. Sloan's polished demeanor cracked under the pressure. "These accusations are baseless," he sputtered. "This is nothing more than a misunderstanding, and we've offered a fair resolution." "A fair resolution?" Tom shot back. "You offered to reimburse a fraction of the costs while refusing to take responsibility. And let's not forget the threats and smear campaign against me." He held up one of the anonymous letters for emphasis, his voice ringing with indignation. "This is how you maintain harmony." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Some residents began demanding answers from Sloan, while others whispered among themselves, clearly unsettled by the evidence. Sensing the tide turning against him, Sloan abruptly adjourned the meeting and stormed out, leaving the board to fend off the crowd's questions. But Tom wasn't done. With Rachel Carter's help, he filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA, seeking damages for theft, emotional distress, and legal fees. The case attracted local media attention, and reporters began showing up at Tom's home, eager for interviews. Rachel used the publicity to apply pressure on the HOA, emphasizing the egregiousness of their actions in court filings and public statements. The HOA, meanwhile, scrambled to contain the fallout. Sloan and his allies tried to downplay the issue, but their attempts backfired when former residents came forward with their own grievances against the board. These stories painted a picture of an HOA that had long operated without accountability, exploiting its power for personal gain. One particularly damning incident involved a retired couple who had been fined thousands of dollars for minor violations, only to discover that the money had been used to fund board members' personal projects. This revelation, combined with Tom's case, shattered what little credibility the board had left. As the court date approached, the pressure on Sloan intensified. The HOA's insurance company, furious at the potential liability, began pushing for a settlement. But Tom refused to back down unless the terms included not only compensation, but also public accountability. On the eve of the trial, Tom received word that the HOA had agreed to a comprehensive settlement. They would pay $150,000 in damages, including reimbursement for the stolen electricity, legal fees, and emotional distress. Additionally, Sloan and 2 other board members would resign, effective immediately. A public apology would be issued to Tom and the community, and the HOA would be required to install independent power lines at their own expense. Tom's victory was a significant blow to the HOA's unchecked authority. The confrontation had been long and grueling, but as he left the courthouse that day, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about compensation. It was about setting things right and ensuring that those who abused their power were held accountable. The settlement marked a turning point in the battle between Tom Bennett and the HOA. Though grueling and contentious, the resolution was undeniably comprehensive. The HOA's agreement to pay $150,000 in damages included reimbursement for the 3 years of stolen electricity, coverage of Tom's legal expenses, and compensation for the stress and disruption the ordeal had caused. However, for Tom, the financial victory was only part of the equation. The deeper satisfaction came from knowing the HOA's leaders were finally being held accountable for their actions. As part of the settlement, Robert Sloan and 2 other board members announced their immediate resignations. Their once confident expressions were replaced by looks of defeat as they read their carefully worded public apology to the community. In it, they acknowledged the theft, apologized for the harm caused, and pledged that the HOA would undergo structural changes to prevent such abuses in the future. The statement was published in the local newspaper and pinned to the HOA's community bulletin board for all residents to see. True to the settlement terms, the HOA began the process of disconnecting their facilities from Tom's property. Within weeks, a team of electricians arrived to install independent power lines for the streetlights and park facilities. Tom watched from his porch as the workers dug trenches and laid cables, finally severing the connection that had caused him so much grief. A new meter box was installed at the entrance to the park, prominently visible as a reminder of the HOA's misdeeds. Meanwhile, the settlement catalyzed broader changes within the HOA. An interim board was appointed, and their first order of business was to implement reforms aimed at increasing transparency. Financial records were opened for resident review, and all board meetings were live-streamed to ensure accountability. These changes were met with widespread approval, with many residents expressing relief that the old regime's unchecked power had finally been dismantled. Tom's role in the resolution didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once avoided him now approached to offer thanks and apologies. Some admitted they had believed the HOA's accusations but now understood the truth. Others praised his determination, saying it inspired them to speak up about their own grievances with the HOA. For Tom, the victory was a bittersweet reminder of the effort it took to right such an egregious wrong. Standing in his backyard one evening, he looked out over the quiet neighborhood that had once felt so hostile. Now the air was lighter and the tension was gone. Though the fight had tested his patience and resilience, it had ultimately brought justice not only for him, but for the entire community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The battle had been hard won, but the peace that followed was worth every step. He knew his efforts would leave a lasting mark, not just in the form of a disconnected cable, but in the lessons learned by a community that had finally reclaimed its integrity. The aftermath of Tom Bennett's battle with the HOA rippled far beyond his property line. The forced resignations of Robert Sloan and the implicated board members marked the beginning of a significant transformation within the community. With the interim board in place, residents began to feel a shift in how the HOA operated. The era of unchecked power and shady practices was over, replaced by transparency and accountability. One of the first major changes was the introduction of financial reforms. For years, residents had little insight into how their dues were being spent. Now, financial reports were audited quarterly by an independent firm and made publicly available to all members. Additionally, board meetings were live-streamed and open to questions from the community, creating a sense of trust that had long been missing. The community itself underwent a cultural shift. Neighbors who had once been passive observers of the HOA's actions began to take an active role in its governance. Some even volunteered for the interim board, determined to ensure such abuses could never happen again. Block parties, volunteer cleanups, and other initiatives became commonplace, fostering a renewed sense of camaraderie among residents. Tom's actions also inspired other homeowners to confront past grievances. Stories emerged of residents who had been unfairly fined or intimidated by the old board, and they now felt emboldened to seek restitution. Many credited Tom for his courage, noting that his persistence had not only corrected a wrong, but also given the community a chance to rebuild on stronger, fairer foundations. Outside the neighborhood, the case drew wider attention. Local media continued to cover the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about the misuse of HOA power. Advocacy groups for property rights highlighted Tom's victory as an example of what could be achieved when homeowners stood their ground. The public scrutiny even prompted regional authorities to begin auditing other HOAs for similar misconduct. For Tom, the changes were gratifying. Though he had never sought to become a community figure, his efforts had undeniably strengthened the neighborhood. Neighbors began greeting him warmly, some stopping by to express gratitude or share their own experiences. The same HOA that had once sought to silence him now extended invitations to events as a gesture of goodwill. The once hostile community was now thriving, a testament to the resilience of its residents and the lessons learned through hard-fought justice. Tom's victory wasn't just his own. It was a catalyst for change that reshaped an entire neighborhood. For Tom Bennett, the journey to justice was as exhausting as it was enlightening. Standing on his porch one breezy evening, he reflected on the months of struggle that had forever altered both his life and the community around him. What had begun as a baffling mystery, soaring electricity bills, had spiraled into a legal battle that exposed corruption, held a powerful HOA accountable, and restored fairness to a neighborhood that had been quietly suffering for years. The victory brought Tom not just compensation, but validation. He had faced immense pressure to stay silent, threats, smear campaigns, and the weight of a powerful organization bearing down on him. Yet he had refused to yield, and his determination became a beacon for others. He realized that standing up for oneself wasn't just a matter of principle, it was a way to empower others to do the same. The lessons from his experience were many. First and foremost, he understood the importance of documentation. Every photograph, every report, and every witness statement had been crucial to his case. He also learned the value of persistence. There were countless moments when quitting seemed easier, but each step forward brought him closer to exposing the truth. More than anything, Tom took pride in the ripple effects of his actions. His fight had sparked systemic changes, not just in his HOA, but across the region. Local governments began cracking down on unregulated practices, and homeowners who had felt powerless began to realize the strength of their collective voice. Tom's case was even referenced in discussions about statewide reforms, making it a touchstone for accountability in community governance. Despite the upheaval, Tom never regretted his decision to pursue justice. His home, once a battleground, had returned to being the peaceful sanctuary he envisioned when he first moved in. The tamper-proof electricity meter outside served as a quiet but powerful symbol of his victory, a daily reminder that no wrongdoing is too small to challenge. The community, too, was thriving. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear and mistrust were now connected by a shared sense of purpose. Invitations to block parties and barbecues regularly appeared in Tom's mailbox, and he often found himself enjoying conversations with people who had once avoided him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Tom allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. His battle had been long and arduous, but it had been worth every step. He had not only protected his home, but also helped create a better, stronger community. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.